If the sprint is the heartbeat of Scrum, the product backlog is its backbone. To be effective, backlogs must be comprised of individual items written in such a way that team members understand not just what work must be completed, but why, which is one reason many Scrum teams use templates to write their backlog items. Now, these can look like Mad Libs for professionals to the untrained eye. The most popular by far is known as a user story. But is this always the best formula to use? The honest answer is no, which is why this episode of Scrumcast is exploring user stories and 3 alternatives for creating effective backlog items. I'm your host, Tom Bullock, and joining me now to talk us through all of this is Scrum Inc. Principal Consultant Avi Schneier. Welcome back, Avi.
Hey, Tom. Good to be back.
So I want to start with what is obviously the most popular version of this template, the user story. Let's start with its basic formula. What is that standard Mad Lib user story formula?
That standard format or formula is as a who, I want what, so that why. I want everybody to remember something before we even start talking about formats, which is this actually part of Scrum? Because the answer is no, and a lot of people think that it is. User stories will not be found in the Scrum Guide. The things that are part of Scrum are in the Scrum Guide. The rest of this stuff is ancillary practices that have helped many Scrum teams over the years, and so it's become widely adopted. The user story is a perfect example coming out of XP. And basically the notion of it is what is the role of the person who you're providing value for? What is it that they're going to do, and why do they want to do it?
And one of the things, just like Scrum itself started in software and is now spread ubiquitous throughout the world in all sorts of different industries, that's the same with the user story. Its strength is that it is customer-centric. It is not about, it's about making sure that the task to be done or the backlog item or whatever it may be comes from a value perspective that is based on value delivered to the customer, correct?
Well, sort of. So what's interesting is the word customer in Scrum. The word customer in Scrum is also incredibly vague, because it could be a whole lot of people. It could be the actual end user, right? Which is why these are called user stories. Or it could be, for example, if you're in a large company, a purchasing agent. That's also a customer, because they're the ones that actually shell out the money. Somebody else actually uses it. And that's why user story doesn't actually refer to the customer. It's not a customer story in that sense. It's a user story. It's specifically looking at the person that's actually, typing,
Gotcha.
doing whatever it is, rather than customer. This is why user is the preferred term.
So the strength here for the user story is what?
The strength of the user story is the empathy with the end user. It is understanding it from their perspective, what pain they are literally going through while using your program. And everybody out there, whether it's software or hardware, and whether you're a producer of it or you're a consumer of it, we have all felt pain, right? Whether it was the inability to adjust the seat properly, or whether I don't understand why is this button here now when in the last version of this program it used to be here now. And we've all gone through OS changes in our life and asked ourselves, why would they conceivably move those sets of buttons to a totally different place where I can't find them? So sure. It's that kind of empathy that we're really looking for.
So that empathy is powerful. That focus on the end user is powerful. It helps us stay focused and create backlog items that deliver value in a better way. We know the strengths now of the user story. So let's challenge convention a little bit. What are its weaknesses?
This is a great question. If you actually go online and spend some time Googling around the people who created user stories, and my favorite one, he's not necessarily credited with it, but he's one of the certainly early promoters, Ron Jeffries, another signer of the Agile Manifesto, alongside Dr. Sutherland. A lot of these people are tremendous detractors of user stories now. They think they've outlived their use and they've become superfluous. One of the biggest things I noticed in the field was there were teams that literally took longer to write the user story.
I've been there.
Actually solve the problem. And that's not the point of user stories. You're not trying to shoehorn every single work item into this format to get it to go. That's not what it's about. So that's certainly one of the biggest detractors. So another limitation of user stories is that when there's no person involved in the work that you're creating, it starts to become confusing. A perfect example of this might be, and let's give some examples from software and hardware. Let's do both. An example from software might be dealing with the API, right? An application protocol, right? Where one part of the program is getting data, an API is collecting data from one part of the system and then sending it to another part of the system. It sounds weird to say, as a system, I need data from place A to send to place B to resolve situation C. It just starts to sound weird when you write things like that. Or for example, you're building an email program, right? It sounds weird for everything to say, as an email account owner, as an email account. It just starts to sound crazy, especially when a human being is not involved. And in this way, there are other story formats that will fit that better and make it sound much more logical, much more logical.
And you said you'd give us a hardware example as well. Why don't we do that just to make sure?
Yeah, so a hardware example, like let's say, for example, you're talking about a braking system. So yes, there's a human being involved when the brake pedal is pressed, but what about all the system pieces, right? Who's the user, for example, of the master cylinder? We might want to say, am I going to write this as a disc brake pad? I need the master cylinder pressure to increase so I can stop the car. Well, that sounds weird. So you would write, as somebody who needs to stop a car, I need to press a brake. But then every single story is me pressing the brake, and it doesn't actually get down to the details of what the engineers have to actually accomplish, which is creating a master cylinder, disc brake. There's all sorts of stuff involved there. Right?
And that is the key issue here. And it gets us actually to our first alternative to the user story. With the system that you're laying out, it's literally about systems. If everything is, I need the car to stop. As a driver, I need to press on the brake. It doesn't actually get you to the point, which is what we're going to, the next system story is the system story. So why don't you walk us through that?
So a system story so first of all, a system story is very easy to write compared to a user story. And you can actually write all your user stories as system stories if you wanted to. Here's the idea. It still contains the same principles, right? Every backlog item has to have a value proposition, who it's for, things like testing constraints, or what we would call acceptance criteria, right? Which may be even beyond testing constraints, right? But it has to have a list of all of these different things. So here's an example. You want to have an action verb. Something's got to happen. You want to have a subject, and then you want to know who or what and some goal that's achieved. So here's an example from working in the consumer packaged goods industry. Let's say, for example, you had a team making a beer, and they want to make now a light beer. So they need to decrease the ABV or alcohol by volume. So to go all the way back to the person and say, as a light beer drinker, I would like a beer with lower alcohol by volume so that I consume less calories. Great. But what's that got to do with what I have to do in the brewery? Nothing. How about this one? Decrease ABV is still not specific enough. Here it's better to say, run the beer in tank 3 through the evaporator so that a lower ABV is achieved. Now I know what I'm supposed to do as a brewery operator that's running on a Scrum team. This is the whole notion. It's got to be descriptive enough of what I'm supposed to do. And I want to know why I'm doing it, right? The who, what, why. It's still in there, even though I'm pointing up because it's on the other screen, right? It's still in there, even though it's not necessarily in that same format. So it's an easier way to write it. Now, in software, this happens a lot, for example, in an API. Sure. Where one part of a program is talking to or talking to another part and then relaying that information to a third part. So where you have a very complex ecosystem and object-oriented architecture, these kinds of stories are incredibly helpful to write because there is no human being involved in between entering data here and then the data output here. There's just a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. These stories help to make that readily apparent.
Now, one thing I want to bring up here, and it's interesting because you still have the focus, obviously, on value. You understand the why, you have context, you know the goal. But I can imagine somebody looking at this example that you put up here of run the beer in tank 3 through the evaporator so that a lower ABV is achieved. And they could question, well, doesn't this step on the how that is the purview of the team? So I'm curious how you answer that.
So in this particular case, I would say the answer is yes, because there is a standard protocol for how you decrease the ABV of a system, but of a beer, I should say. So there's a standard way to decrease the ABV of a beer. So yes, that in this particular case, it is very specific. But we could also have a story that just mentions decreasing ABV that is innovative, and then let the teams kind of figure out different ways to do so. So I understand your point, but the other part, the flip side of it is, what if we already have a practice in place?
Sure.
right? So an example, what might be writing the API is if you're writing a story to say, I need the API to gather data from portion of system A and relay it to portion of system B. We're not telling them how to relay it. It's just got to get there, and there it opens up for the team to innovate the how. This particular example, you're right, doesn't have that because a standard practice of how it is done is presented. But if, for example, we wanted to say, let's just make sure we have a lower alcohol beer, that would be a very openly phrased question. But again, this is where we're talking about a system story rather than a user story or a story, for example, that would be used for innovation. This is simply saying, hey, we need to get this done. Here's the best way that's known at the moment, or the standard way inside of our company to do it. And again, since we want to make all work visible, that's different. One advantage of the user story, Tom, that you bring up is that open-ended conversation. And that's why, for example, even myself, I still use user stories, or I should say, I still use the user story format. Mm-hmm. But I use it when I'm talking about epics rather than in user stories. One of the things that we see commonly being not done in the world of Agile land is that people aren't writing their epics or their quarterly initiatives this way. And that might be a mistake because you could use this format to write your epics because that's where your customer visible value is. And as we say in our classes, it's a lot easier to judge business value at the epic level than the story level. So here is a great place where user story format should be used, which is the epic story, right? The phrasing of the epic, as opposed to the phrasing of the individual stories, or even worse, the individual tasks, right? That would be even more worse.
So if we could, let's go back here to system story. Yeah. And I'm curious, we've talked a lot about the strength. Its format is pretty clear. Action, verb, subject, what they're going to do, right? Or what's going to have the thing done to it, or what's going to happen, so that who gets what, or what goal is achieved. What is the weakness of this particular system story?
I think you pointed it out. I think in system stories, we are delving a lot more into the how in the statement. So it may decrease innovation while it increases, let's call it internal compliance. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's always going to be that trade-off of constraints versus innovation, right? Loosen the constraints, increase the innovation, right? So here we're applying a little bit more constraint practice to it, and for that function. And so the disadvantage would be the loss of innovative space.
Maybe. Yeah.
Potentially, I should say.
So I want to move on to our next example or alternative to the classic user story. And this is something that we refer to as a job story. So let's walk through that formula.
So I became pretty passionate about the whole notion of job stories after I learned about what was called job to be done. And in the job to be done world, and this is a movement that started many, many decades ago, people in Harvard Business School, and it's taken it on a life of its own. The idea of the job story comes out of jobs to be done. So let me explain jobs to be done first a little bit, and then we'll talk about the idea of the story. The whole notion of jobs to be done is to take a look rather than from your user's perspective of what they want, but rather instead from the user's perspective of what they're trying to achieve. So it's all about the so that, if you think about the traditional user story format. A classic example that they give, let's use the classic ones, is nobody needs a 1/4-inch drill. Everybody needs a 1/4-inch hole. So for example, if I want to put a new hook in the wall behind me and I need a 1/4-inch hole for that, there's a lot of ways I could do that. I could go upstairs to my kitchen and get a knife and a hammer and chisel it out. The 1/4-inch drill bit happens to do it the nicest, the cleanest, the most efficiently. So I'm buying the 1/4-inch drill to do this job. And the whole notion of this is human beings have all these tools, and computer programs are tools just as well as drill bits or anything else is. We hire the tool to do a certain job. That's the whole notion of jobs to be done. We're hiring these tools. And what are you hiring? How does that work? So this is that classic example. I'm hiring the 1/4-inch drill to drill that 1/4-inch hole, but it's the hole that I actually need. So it's taking the emphasis off of the person or the persona and making the unit of function in discussion the job. Mm-hmm. Now, a classic example of how they show this juxtaposition was with milkshakes. And please entertain me for a little, I'll tell you the story. The idea was they had a company, a drive-through restaurant, which many of us have eaten at, that wanted to increase its sale of milkshakes. So they started to look at it from the way most marketing organizations with marketing do is they said, let's go interview the people who buy and consume milkshakes. This is the same thing we do in Scrum. The product owner goes and speaks to the user of the product and says, great, how are you using it? What's it like? What would you like different? The whole thing, right? So they interview these people about milkshakes. Would you like them to be thicker? Do you want them to be more chocolatey, less sugar, whatever, okay? They took all their answers and then they started to run experiments, as we would do in Scrum, making different versions of the milkshakes. And guess what they found out? Didn't matter what change they made, did not increase the consumption of milkshakes. Now, this company then hired an outside consultancy, not Scrum Inc., that specialized in this whole jobs to be done thing. And here's what they discovered. They started to interview them based on the notion of what job is the milkshake accomplishing. Now that sounds totally weird. The milkshake does a job? They found out that when people were buying the milkshakes, now Tom, it's not you and I. You and I probably enjoy a milkshake in the afternoon or the evening. But most of the milkshakes are actually being sold in the morning. Huh? That sounds weird. So they started to talk to those people about it. And here's what they found out. These people were on their way driving to work. They needed a snack that, one, would fill them up and carry them all the way through lunch. Two, prevented the boredom of driving. So it had to have a long enough consumption time for them to do something. And three, and this is what I think is the interesting part, fill them up until lunch. So they asked them, well, what would you normally eat if you didn't have a milkshake? And one answer was a bagel. What's the problem with a bagel? Well, I can eat the bagel with one hand, but if it's got too much stuff in it, now it gets all messy. I can't eat that when I'm driving. And conversely, I would have a banana, but the bananas or the donut is not filling enough to get me all the way to lunch. At 10 o'clock, I'm hungry again. So they realized that the job to be done by the milkshake was this, all three of these things. And now they could target making those three things better, as well as target the persona that wanted that and say, hey, stop buying donuts, stop buying bananas, stop buying bagels, start buying milkshakes. And the health concern, by the way, didn't come into play. What happened once they instituted the new marketing around this? The consumption of milkshakes increased dramatically. So looking at it from a job perspective is very, very different. So the idea of the job stories we have displayed here on the screen is that the persona may often be irrelevant. And we downplay the persona instead for the motivation, the why I'm using the thing. So the why they were using the milkshake, fill me up till 10 o'clock. Oh, and by the way, it took them 5 minutes to eat a donut. That wasn't long enough to prevent boredom on the drive in. The milkshake, because it was thick, took 20 minutes to consume. Okay, so there's more motivation. I want to be bored less. So we're taking a look at the motivations here, and then the expected outcome is still there. Now, the truth is, when it comes to the actions, a lot of times, and this is where the freedom notion comes in, right? We don't know what the best action to take is. So again, we really want to look at motivation because the action itself may be too specific. So what does the job story look like? Here's how it's phrased. When blank, I want blank so I can blank. So that expected outcome is still there. The difference is now we're changing, and remember the want is still there, but we're changing it to the motivation behind the want. So it's not I want X, it's the why of why I want X.
And it's situation-based as well. The user story is actually based on in this particular scenario.
Exactly. And the reason why we do that is take for example, and let's use a software example, right? Something as simple as logging into a system. So there are lots of different users in a system. There's certain people, right? Like the customers, there's the administrators of the system, there's the people who repair, there's all sorts of different people that have to log in. They all have to do the same thing. It doesn't matter. You don't have to write it for their persona. So when persona doesn't matter, you're looking at just the job to be done, logging into the system. When someone wants to log into the system, I want them to enter their password so that I know an authenticated user has entered the system. There's a lot of different ways you could write this from the perspective of what we're trying to achieve, whether it's in a system, whether it's for a person or anything. And again, software or hardware doesn't matter, right? When the brake pedal is depressed, I don't have to say when the driver is it. I don't have to talk about a certain kind of driver. When the brake pedal is depressed, I want the car to come to a halt within 60 feet so that it doesn't crash into a wall. You could write whatever it is.
Sure.
The whole notion is we're looking at what is the person trying to accomplish by employing our product.
So you're obviously I'm sorry, Avi, go ahead.
Yeah, so job stories work both from that epic perspective or from even the task perspective. They can be used throughout with tremendous clarity.
So you're obviously very passionate about job stories.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to ask you, though, in the interest of fairness and transparency, which obviously we value in Scrum, what are the weaknesses of this particular formula?
The weakness is the lack of the persona, and that's why we in the most of us who are promoting this now, we're saying after you figure this out, bring the persona back in, because there's a very different use case for different personas. They may have similar outcomes that they achieve, but they have very different motivations, right? So most of us, a lot of people here are using Windows systems, right? And we may be familiar with the phrase power user. So a lot of people using applications from the Microsoft brand that are power users are using a vastly different feature set than those of us that are using Microsoft Word just to type something and throw a couple of bullets at it and then send it off. We're not using mail merge. We're not using the Visual Basic editor that Microsoft Word has. This is where that comes in. So when you have a different use cases, then you can still use the job story because they still want to achieve the same outcome. I want a really great looking Word document, but they're going to have a different feature set available because they do have different personas.
So are those personas then, Avi, are they, I mean, instead of focusing on the use, it's the desired, it's their motivation. That's where the personas come in. So the situation would stay at the front of this formula, and the personas
100%.
would actually be slid into this motivation, and you can create different stories based on that.
That's right. It's when we need X done, user X wants such and such. Perfect example again, Tom. I just built my wife a brand new weight bench, and of course I used a ratchet set. I don't use a ratchet set like a professional mechanic would. I don't need an air gun. I don't need. It's a very, very different situation. So this is where, as a manufacturer of goods or a producer of computer programs or whatever your company makes, this is where you're going to start to think, how does that work? And this is where Agile actually comes in, if you really think about the core of it, right? The whole notion of Agile was born, much like Scrum was, out of hardware and brought into software. The very first book about Agile talked about lean manufacturing and lean manufacturers versus what they called Agile manufacturers. And the idea was that Agile went beyond lean by, number one, bringing the customer in. We all know that part. But number two, making things reusable. And what do I mean by that? Well, again, the notion of object-oriented architecture and programming, or you could think about parts of a car vehicle. I like to use cars as an example, we're most familiar, that are reusable from model to model or production line to production line. So you could have a radiator, for example. The radiator, for example, in the Toyota Avalon is the same as the radiator in the Lexus ES250. One's Toyota, one's Lexus. Remember, Toyota owns both brands, and so they can reuse the parts in many different places. This was one of the primary notions of agility, was to manufacture things that could be reused in multiple different circumstances and sold as if it was something different, right? So you can use the same graphics engine inside of a video game and then use it again in the next video game that you make, even though they're two totally distinct products, but they're coming from the same video game company.
So let's step back for a second, Avi. We've talked about user stories. We've talked about system stories. We've talked about job stories. We've talked about strengths and weaknesses to all of them. The user story is very specifically focused on the end user. The system story is very much focused on achieving a goal through a set process. For systems, there's no necessarily an individual end user. It's more, system to system. And a job story is like a user story, but it focuses instead of on the persona itself, it focuses on their motivation for a desired outcome. Mm-hmm. And what it sounds like to me is what you are saying is not that one is better than the other. It's that all of these can be used in beneficial ways given different scenarios or different desires or different tasks at hand.
100%.
Is that then what you would suggest for a backlog? It doesn't have to just be one template. It could be a mix of these.
It should be that. It should be situational. We should never think that there's only one way to do anything. That once you say there's one way to do only one way to do something, somebody else is doing it a different way and making more money and doing it better than you. That's my general opinion. Absolutely. The whole notion why this whole discussion comes up is because in most Scrum training, or if you go out and do your own research, the user story is all over the place. And then you think, I have to only use this format, and then it becomes limited and restricting. I became a big fan of job stories because most of my work is actually outside of software. My specialty is Scrum outside of IT, where the user story actually makes almost no sense almost all the time. And especially when we're designing very, very large mechanical systems. So for us, once I started using the job story, the people that I was working with were like, oh, this is so much better. We get this. And that's the whole point of it. We get this. And the we get this isn't we, the end customer, the user. The we get this is the team that's making it. It's all about choosing a format between the product owner who's understanding what the end customer, end user, what is desired. They're trying to translate that into the team, right? The product owner is the known stable interface between the team and the rest of the world, whether that rest of the world is a customer, an end user, somebody else in the company, whatever it is. As that translation bridge, they've got to figure out, how can I explain to these folks, this awesome group of makers that I work with, how do I explain to them what is desired? So it's about figuring out what format helps them to understand it. And that's where the templates help. But essentially what you're talking about, I think, is what if we had no template? And the answer is, that's okay too.
And that was actually going to be my final question, which is, in any given situation, the most important thing seems to find what works best as an information radiator, a system of conveying not just what needs to be done, but why, and the context that the team in particular, the people doing the work, need in order to get it done well, right, high quality, fast, the whole bit. So let's address that. Like, templates are handy, templates are useful, but templates are not required.
So, again, to your point, Tom, is there a format needed? And the answer is actually kind of no. What's needed is what you can see I'm sharing on the screen here. Is we need 5 things. We need a value proposition, because we want to make sure that anything we're doing is valuable to someone. We need a recipient of that value. We need an action needed, because people are doing stuff. This isn't just, it's not just kicks and giggles here. And then we need to know our constraints and our testing criteria. When you have all of this, you don't need any specific format, but you do have to satisfy this, because the people making your stuff have to know who it's for, why it is, and what constraints they live in, right? Because if you lose constraints or you lose testing criteria, we have no idea if it'll actually work in whatever system we live in, or if it actually functions on its own. So as long as you got this, format becomes kind of irrelevant.
So it's a handy tool, but one that should only be deployed when needed.
Correct. It's a handy tool, but it should only be employed when needed. And this is another reason why we've moved away a lot in our own trainings at Scrum Inc., away from the words stories and epics. We just refer to everything as product backlog items. And we encourage our clients to come up with whatever hierarchical terminology that they need for things. If they want to use epic and story and task, be my guest. If they want to call it something else, if they want to call it roots and stems and leaves, knock yourself out, have a good time. The important thing is that everybody knows the vocabulary and understands what level of granularity the vocabulary is at. And then how you phrase those work items, it just has to meet these criteria. It doesn't have to be in any specific format. Those templates that we've got, they're just convenient ways that have been used very often and people feel very comfortable.
As always, Avi, it's been educational and entertaining. Thank you much.
Thank you, Tom. I look forward to seeing you again on a different Scrumcast.
Absolutely. And if you found value in this conversation and haven't done so already, please subscribe or like our channel. And for more patterns, techniques, case studies, and tactics for agile transformation or Scrum use in general, visit our website, scruminc.com.